The wedding procession wound through the dusty streets of Milford like a funeral march, and Grasha knew every eye that watched from shuttered windows saw her as exactly what they whispered she was. A mistake, a monster, the ugliest orc bride the province had ever been cursed to witness. She kept her chin level despite the weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders, her calloused hands gripping the rough fabric of her ceremonial dress so tightly her knuckles turned a paler shade of green. The dress itself was an insult, cobbled together from old grain sacks and dyed an unfortunate shade of brown that made her look like she had crawled from the earth itself. Her tusks, small as they were for an orc, protruded just slightly over her lower lip, and she had heard the children pointing and giggling when she passed. Beautiful she was not, and every mirror and puddle had confirmed this truth since she was old enough to understand what beauty meant in the eyes of humans and orcs alike. Her soon-to-be husband walked ahead of her, not beside her as tradition dictated, and Vincent Osworth carried himself with the rigid posture of a man marching to his doom. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that had not once met hers since their families had arranged this union. His family owned the largest farm in 3 counties, sprawling fields of wheat and barley that fed half the province, while her orcish clan scraped by in the borderlands, taking whatever work humans would grudgingly offer. This marriage was a treaty wrapped in white lies and desperate hopes, a bridge between 2 peoples who had spent generations trying to kill each other. The war had ended 5 years ago, but peace was still a fragile, trembling thing, and Grasha was the sacrifice laid upon its altar. The magistrate's house loomed ahead, a squat building of gray stone that seemed to glower at the world. Vincent's mother stood by the entrance, her face pinched and pale, while his father looked everywhere except at Grasha. Neither of her own parents had been permitted to attend. Orcs in the town square were one thing, but orcs in a human building of authority were apparently quite another. She had said goodbye to them at dawn, her mother's rough hands cupping her face, her father's voice breaking as he told her to be strong, to survive, to remember she carried the hopes of their entire clan on her broad shoulders. The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. Vincent spoke his vows in a monotone that suggested he was reciting a list of chores. Grasha's voice shook only once, when she promised to honor and cherish a man who would not look at her. The magistrate pronounced them husband and wife with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a plague. No one threw rice or flower petals. No one cheered. Vincent's mother wept quietly into a handkerchief, mourning the proper human bride her son would never have. They rode to the Osworth farm in a wagon, sitting on opposite sides, the autumn wind cutting between them like a blade. The farm sprawled across the landscape in every direction, fields already harvested and lying fallow for winter, a large stone house with a thatched roof, barns and storage buildings scattered like children's toys. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like arriving at a prison where she would serve a sentence measured in decades. Vincent climbed down from the wagon and disappeared into the house without a word. His foreman, a grizzled man named Harrow, helped Grasha down with obvious reluctance, his hand releasing hers the moment her feet touched the ground as though her green skin might contaminate him. He pointed her toward the house with a grunt and then vanished toward the barns. She stood alone in the yard as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rust, beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to her suffering. The house was well built and sturdy, with thick walls and good shutters. The main room held a large fireplace, a solid table, chairs that looked like they had been crafted by skilled hands. Everything was clean and orderly, the home of people who took pride in their possessions. Grasha found her belongings, such as they were, deposited in a small room off the kitchen. Not the master bedroom, then. That was fine. She had expected nothing else. She unpacked her few dresses, her mother's carved wooden comb, a small knife her father had made for her when she turned 13. These things filled perhaps a tenth of the available space in the simple wardrobe. Vincent did not come to find her that evening. She heard him moving around upstairs, heard the creak of floorboards and the sound of a door closing. She made herself a small meal from the food in the larder, bread and cheese and cold meat, eating alone at the table as darkness filled the windows. She washed her plate and cup, banked the fire, and retreated to her small room where she lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this strange house, wondering if this was how the rest of her life would feel. Empty, silent, alone even while married. The first week passed in a blur of humiliation and silence. Vincent rose before dawn and worked until after dark, coming in only for quick, wordless meals that Grasha learned to have ready at the proper times. He never thanked her. He never acknowledged her presence except as one might note a piece of furniture. His workers followed his example, speaking to her only when absolutely necessary, their eyes sliding away from her face as though ugliness might be contagious. She heard them sometimes when they thought she was out of earshot, making jokes about the beast in the boss's house, wondering how he could stand to live under the same roof as one of the savage greenies. She worked because she did not know what else to do. She cleaned the house until it gleamed, swept and scrubbed and polished. She cooked meals that grew more elaborate as she learned the contents of the larder and the root cellar. She mended clothes and washed linens, and did all the tasks her mother had taught her a wife should do. Vincent never commented on any of it. If she served him a perfect roast with vegetables and rich gravy, he ate it with the same expression he had worn when eating plain bread. If the floor shone like glass, he walked across it without noticing. On the 8th day, she found his mother's garden behind the house, overgrown and dying. Vincent's mother had died 2 years earlier. She had learned from bits of overheard conversation, and no one had tended her roses and herbs since. Grasha spent that afternoon pulling weeds, cutting back dead growth, murmuring the small prayers her grandmother had taught her for sleeping plants. Her hands, stronger than any human woman's, made quick work of the hardened soil. She did not notice Vincent watching from the barn door until she had been working for an hour. When she finally looked up, he turned away quickly and vanished back inside. The winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with teeth of ice and claws of wind. Snow piled in drifts against the barn walls, and the livestock huddled together for warmth. Grasha woke one morning to find the house bone achingly cold, the fire having died sometime in the night. She rebuilt it quickly, her orc constitution making her more resistant to the cold than Vincent would be. She had breakfast ready when he came downstairs, his breath misting in the still chilly air. For the first time since their wedding, he looked directly at her. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice rough from disuse and sleep. "I am not weak," she replied, meeting his eyes, refusing to look away first. "The cold does not hurt me as it hurts you." Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. He nodded once, ate his breakfast in the usual silence, and left for the barns. But the next morning when she woke, the fire was already burning, rebuilt by hands that were not her own. Small changes came slowly, like snow melting at winter's end. Vincent began to leave notes when he needed something, short messages in surprisingly elegant handwriting. "Bread for the workers at noon." "Harrow's wife is ill, can you spare soup?" She fulfilled these requests without comment, and the notes continued, gradually becoming less terse. "The bread yesterday was excellent. Harrow's wife thanks you. She learned the rhythms of the farm, the early mornings and late evenings, the constant cycle of feeding and cleaning and repairing. She learned which cow kicked and which horse liked to have its ears scratched. She learned that Harrow's gruff exterior hid a man who sang to the sheep when he thought no one was listening, and that the youngest farmhand, a boy barely 16, was terrified of her, until she helped him splint a bird's broken wing and he saw her hands could be gentle. Spring arrived in an explosion of green and gold, the fields coming to life, plowing and planting consuming every waking hour. Grasha worked alongside the men when hands were short, her strength making her worth 3 human workers. She could haul sacks of seed that would have required 2 men to lift, could work the plow behind the horses for hours without tiring. The workers stopped making jokes, at least within her hearing. They started to nod when she approached. One afternoon, Harrow actually asked her opinion on whether a fence post was set deep enough. Vincent watched her during these weeks with an expression she could not read. She would feel his gaze on her as she worked, but when she turned to look, he was always focused on something else. He began to eat his meals more slowly, as though he was not quite so eager to escape her presence. He asked her once if she needed anything from the town, and when she said no, he looked almost disappointed. The night the spring storm hit, Grasha was awakened by the terrified screaming of horses. She bolted from her bed and ran outside in only her nightgown, her bare feet slapping against the mud. Lightning had struck one of the barns, and flames were already licking up the dry wood. The horses inside were trapped, mad with fear. She did not think, did not hesitate. She ran into the smoke and fire, her skin more resistant to the heat than human flesh would be, and began hauling horses out one by one, ignoring their flailing hooves and snapping teeth. Vincent arrived as she was dragging out the 3rd horse, and his face went white when he saw her vanishing back into the flames for the 4th. He screamed at her to stop, but she could not hear him over the roar of the fire and the shrieking animals. She got the 4th horse out, and the 5th, and by the time she emerged with the 6th and final one, half the barn was gone and the other men had formed a bucket brigade to save what remained. She collapsed in the mud, coughing, her nightgown scorched and torn, her hands blistered even through her tough skin. Vincent dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her as though he wanted to touch her but did not know how. "You fool," he said, and his voice broke. "You absolute fool, you could have died." "The horses," she managed to say through her raw throat. "Damn the horses." He was shaking, she realized. His whole body trembled. "Damn the horses, damn the barn, you could have died, do you understand? You could have died." She stared at him, too shocked by the emotion in his voice to respond. He helped her stand, his hands firm on her arms, and for the first time since their wedding, he touched her with something other than reluctant obligation. He half carried her back to the house and made her sit by the fire while he brought cloths and cool water for her burns. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the soot from her face. "I have been terrible to you," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "No, worse than terrible. I have been cruel without cause. You did not ask for this marriage any more than I did, but I punished you for it anyway. I saw an orc when I should have seen a person. I saw a burden when I should have seen a partner. And tonight you risked your life for my horses, and I realize I do not even deserve your contempt, much less your courage." Grasha's throat ached from smoke and suppressed tears. "You did not want this," she whispered. "You did not want me." "No," he agreed, and the word hurt even though she had known it was true. "But I begin to think I was wrong about what I wanted." He finally looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something in his dark eyes that had not been there before. "You are stronger than any person I have ever known. You are kinder than I have any right to expect. And you are beautiful in ways I was too blind and too foolish to see." She laughed bitterly, the sound scraping her damaged throat. "I am the ugliest orc bride in the province. Everyone says so. Your mother wept to see me. My mother wept because she knew she had raised a son who would treat you badly." His jaw tightened. "She warned me before she died. She said bitterness would poison me if I let it. She said the war took too much from us, and we could not let it take our humanity too. I did not listen. I let my anger at the orcs who killed my brother turn into anger at you, and that was unforgivable." Grasha had not known he had lost a brother. She had not known anything about him, really, because he had never told her and she had been too afraid to ask. "I am sorry," she said. "For your loss, for the war, for all of it. I am the one who should apologize." He took a shaky breath. "Will you let me try again? Will you let me be the husband I should have been from the beginning?" She looked at him, at the genuine remorse in his face, at the way his hand still rested gently on her arms as though he could not quite bring himself to let go. She thought about the notes he had started to leave, the fire he had tended, the small gestures that had appeared like green shoots through snow. She thought about the terror in his voice when he had screamed at her to leave the burning barn. "Yes," she said, and watched something like relief flood his expression. The change was not sudden or complete, but it was real. Vincent began to eat his meals at a normal pace, sometimes even lingering over his plate to tell her about his day. He asked her about her clan, about her childhood, about the foods and songs and stories of her people. He listened when she answered, asked follow-up questions, remembered what she told him. He started to introduce her to people when they came to the farm, not as "my wife" in a tone of apology, but as Grasha in a voice that held no shame. The workers noticed the shift and adjusted accordingly. Harrow started to actually smile at her, and the young farmhand asked her to teach him some orcish words. The neighboring farmers were slower to come around, but even they could not help but notice that the Osworth farm was thriving. The crops grew tall and strong. The animals were healthy. The buildings were well maintained. And the orc woman worked as hard as any 3 men, never complaining, always ready to help when help was needed. Vincent taught her to read and write in the common tongue, sitting with her in the evenings after the day's work was done, patiently correcting her clumsy letters. She taught him Orcish in return, laughing at his fumbling attempts to produce the guttural sounds. These lessons often dissolved into laughter, the kind of easy warmth that Grasha had thought she would never feel in this house. He started to sit closer to her, their shoulders touching as they bent over the slate. His hand would brush hers when passing a book, and the touch would linger just a moment too long to be accidental. Summer arrived in a wave of heat and long, golden days. The wheat grew tall and green, and Vincent hired extra workers for the harvest. Grasha cooked for the crews, massive pots of stew and loaves of bread, and the men no longer hesitated to thank her. One of them, emboldened by good food and gratitude, told Vincent he was lucky to have such a capable wife. Vincent had agreed so readily, so emphatically, that Grasha felt her cheeks warm with something that was not quite embarrassment. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance over the fields, Vincent reached over and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused from work, and it fit against hers as though they had been carved to match. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. Grasha's heart jumped into her throat. "What is it?" "I have been writing letters," he continued, still looking out at the fields rather than at her. "To the provincial governor, to the magistrates, to anyone with the authority to change things. I have been telling them about you, about how hard you work, about how much you have contributed to this farm and this community. I have been arguing that orcs should be allowed to own property, to hold positions of responsibility, to be treated as full citizens rather than conquered subjects. She stared at him, unable to speak. No human had ever advocated for orcs before, not in any official capacity. The treaty that ended the war had been built on the assumption that orcs would always be lesser, would always exist at the margins of human society. "I know it may come to nothing," he said, finally turning to look at her. "I know there is more prejudice than I can fight alone, but I cannot stay silent, not when I live with the proof every day that everything they say about your people is a lie. Not when the woman who shares my home is worth more than a dozen of the so-called proper humans who turned their noses up at our wedding." "Vincent," she whispered, and found she could not say anything more. Her throat had closed around the words. He squeezed her hand gently. "You do not have to say anything. I just wanted you to know. I wanted you to know that I see you now. I see your worth, and I will make others see it too, even if it takes the rest of my life." She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together, and they sat like that until the stars came out, connected by a touch that spoke all the words neither of them quite knew how to say. The first response to Vincent's letters arrived in early autumn, just as the leaves were beginning to turn. The provincial governor acknowledged his correspondence and requested a meeting. Vincent left for the capital with a folder of documents and a determined set to his jaw, and Grasha ran the farm in his absence with Harrow's gruff assistance. Vincent was gone for a week, and every day felt like a small eternity. She found herself watching the road, listening for the sound of his horse, and had to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding for months. She did not simply tolerate him anymore. She did not simply appreciate his kindness. She loved him, fully and desperately, in a way that made her chest ache and her hands shake. When he finally returned, dusty and exhausted, she ran out to meet him before she could stop herself. He slid down from his horse and caught her when she collided with him, his arms wrapping around her automatically. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the yard, and Grasha felt something inside her click into place, a piece of the world settling into its proper position. "I missed you," he said into her hair, and she could hear the truth of it in his voice. "I missed you too," she replied, and felt him smile against the top of her head. The meeting with the governor had gone better than expected, he told her that evening. The governor was a pragmatic man, more interested in results than tradition, and Vincent's farm was one of the most productive in the province. The governor had agreed to consider Vincent's proposals, particularly the one about allowing orcs to own property. It was not a victory yet, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall of prejudice that had stood for so long. As autumn deepened and the harvest came in, neighboring farmers began to visit more frequently, ostensibly to discuss crop yields and market prices, but Grasha noticed they all seemed curious about her. They would watch her work, would accept the refreshments she offered, and would leave looking thoughtful rather than disgusted. One farmer, an elderly man named Castor who owned the property to the south, actually thanked her for her advice on treating a sick calf. His wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Mira, invited Grasha to the next women's gathering in town. Grasha almost refused. The thought of sitting in a room full of human women who had probably mocked her wedding procession was terrifying. But Vincent encouraged her to go, and Harrow's wife offered to accompany her, so she found herself walking into the town hall on a crisp October morning, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room fell silent when she entered. 24 human women turned to stare at the orc in their midst. Grasha wanted to run, wanted to turn around and walk out and never come back. But then Mira stood up and gestured to an empty chair beside her. "Come sit," she said in a voice that carried across the room. "We are discussing the winter festival preparations, and we could use someone with organizational skills." It was not an immediate acceptance, but it was not a rejection either. Grasha sat, and the meeting continued, and though many of the women still looked uncomfortable, they did not leave. By the end of the gathering, Grasha had been assigned to help coordinate the food donations, a task that seemed designed to use her proven cooking abilities. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Vincent was inordinately pleased when she told him about it. "You see," he said, grinning, "they are starting to understand what I already know, that you are remarkable." "I am just an orc," she said, but she could not help smiling. "You are not just anything," he replied, and the intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "You are Grasha, and you are the best thing that has ever happened to this farm, to this community." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer. "To me." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something electric and fragile. They were standing close together in the kitchen, closer than necessary, and Grasha could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She had become so aware of him over the past months, of his presence and his moods and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Now, with him looking at her like that, she felt like she might spontaneously combust from the intensity of her own feelings. "Vincent," she whispered, and his name on her lips seemed to break something loose inside him. He reached up and cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones, tracing the curve of her tusks with a gentleness that made her want to weep. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough and uncertain. "Please, may I kiss you?" She nodded, unable to speak, and he closed the distance between them with aching slowness, as though giving her every opportunity to pull away. His lips met hers softly, tentatively, a question more than a demand. She answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened into something urgent and hungry and long overdue. They broke apart gasping, and Vincent rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I love you," he said, the words tumbling out as though he had been holding them back for too long. "I love you so much it terrifies me. I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love the way you hum when you cook and the way you talk to the animals. I love that you are patient with my fumbling attempts to speak your language. I love everything about you, and I am so sorry it took me this long to say it." Grasha felt tears spilling down her cheeks, hot and fast. "I love you too," she managed to say through the tightness in her throat. "I have loved you for months, but I was afraid you could never love someone like me. Someone like you." He pulled back to look at her, his expression fierce. "You mean someone brave and beautiful and perfect." "I am not beautiful," she protested automatically, a lifetime of mirrors and mockery making the denial instinctive. "You are to me," he said firmly. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known. And even if the entire world disagrees, even if every person in this province calls you ugly, I will still know the truth. I will still see what I see every time I look at you. Strength and grace, and a beauty that has nothing to do with symmetrical features and everything to do with the person you are." She kissed him again, because she did not have words sufficient to express what she felt. They stood in the kitchen, holding each other as the afternoon light faded into evening, and Grasha felt like she had finally come home. Not to this house, not to this farm, but to this person, this man who had learned to see past the prejudices of his upbringing and love her for who she truly was. That night, Vincent moved her belongings from the small room off the kitchen to the master bedroom upstairs. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies with reverence and care, and afterward, Grasha lay in his arms feeling more whole than she had ever felt in her life. This was what marriage was supposed to be, she thought. This connection, this intimacy, this sense of belonging utterly to another person and having them belong to you in return. The winter festival arrived in early December, and Grasha worked tirelessly to help coordinate the community feast. She contributed 3 massive pots of stew made from her grandmother's recipe, rich and savory and spiced in ways the humans had never tasted before. She also baked dozens of loaves of bread and 3 different kinds of pastries, pushing herself to demonstrate her skills, to prove her worth to people who had spent a year doubting it. The festival was held in the town square, with long tables set up in rows and torches burning against the early darkness. Families arrived bundled in their winter coats, their breath misting in the cold air. Grasha helped serve the food, her hands steady despite her nervousness, and watched as people took their first cautious bites of her cooking. The change in their expressions was gradual but unmistakable. Eyes widened. Eyebrows rose. People went back for second and third helpings of the orc stew, the exotic flavors winning over even the most skeptical palates. Children begged their parents for more of the sweet pastries. Old Castor declared loudly that his wife should get the orc's recipe, or he would have nothing but disappointment for the rest of his life. Vincent stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, his pride in her so obvious it made her blush. When the magistrate stood to make the traditional festival speech, he surprised everyone by thanking Grasha by name for her contributions to the feast. The applause that followed was tentative but real. After the meal, as people milled around talking and children played in the snow, Mira approached with several other women. "That stew was extraordinary," she said bluntly. "You have to teach us how to make it." "And the pastries," added another woman, younger with kind eyes. "My daughter has talked about nothing else for the past hour." Grasha felt something loosen in her chest. "I would be happy to teach you," she said, "if you truly want to learn." "We do," Mira said firmly, "and perhaps you could teach us some other things too. Orcish techniques for preserving food, for treating illnesses. My mother always said the old orc healers knew things we humans had forgotten." It was an olive branch, extended with practicality rather than sentiment, but it was real. Grasha accepted it with a nod and a smile, and the women drifted away chattering about recipes and remedies. Vincent pulled her close and kissed her temple. "I told you," he murmured. "They just needed time to see what I see." The winter passed in a blur of teaching and learning, as Grasha held informal gatherings at the farm where human women came to learn orcish cooking and healing techniques. In return, they taught her the intricate embroidery and weaving patterns that human culture valued. Friendships formed slowly, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than immediate affection, but they were real and solid and made Grasha feel less alone in this human world. Vincent's advocacy work continued as well. He traveled to the capital twice more over the winter, each time returning with small victories. The governor had agreed to a pilot program allowing select orcs to apply for property ownership. The magistrates had revised the trade laws to permit orcs to engage in commerce without human sponsors. These were small changes, barely visible cracks in the edifice of prejudice, but they mattered. In early spring, a letter arrived that changed everything. The provincial governor requested that Vincent and Grasha attend a formal dinner at the capital, where the governor would be announcing new policies regarding orc rights and citizenship. The letter specifically mentioned that Grasha's presence was essential, as the governor wished to use their marriage as an example of successful human-orc integration. Grasha was terrified. The thought of standing in front of provincial officials and wealthy humans, of being examined and judged and used as an example, made her want to hide in the root cellar and never come out. But Vincent held her hands and reminded her that this was what they had been working toward. This was the chance to make a real difference, not just for themselves but for every orc in the province who wanted to live a full life rather than existing in the margins. They traveled to the capital in early April, when the roads were finally clear of winter mud. The city was overwhelming, tall buildings crowded together, streets full of people and noise and unfamiliar smells. Grasha had never seen anything like it. She pressed close to Vincent's side as they made their way to the inn where they would stay, trying not to flinch every time someone stared at her green skin and tusks. The dinner was held in the governor's mansion, a sprawling building of white stone with columns and marble floors. Grasha wore her finest dress, a deep blue gown that Vincent had commissioned from the best seamstress in Milford. The woman had been skeptical at first, but had warmed to the challenge of designing something that would flatter an orc's broader shoulders and athletic build. The result was stunning, and when Grasha looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not the ugly orc bride the town had mocked but a strong, capable woman who had earned her place at this table. The dinner itself was an ordeal of silverware and small talk, of navigating human etiquette while being scrutinized by dozens of curious eyes. But the governor was kind, and his wife went out of her way to make Grasha feel welcome. They asked her thoughtful questions about her experiences, about her perspective on integration, about what changes would be most meaningful to orc communities. She answered as honestly as she could, her voice steady despite her nerves, and tried to articulate the basic dignity and opportunity that her people needed. The governor's speech came after the dessert course. He stood and addressed the assembled crowd, talking about the importance of moving forward from the war, of building a province that valued merit and contribution over race and tradition. He spoke about the Osworth farm, about how one of the most productive and well-run operations in the province was a partnership between a human man and an orc woman. He announced a comprehensive set of reforms, including the right for orcs to own land, to enter contracts, to attend schools and to hold positions in local government. The room erupted in mixed reactions. Some applauded enthusiastically. Others looked shocked or angry. But the governor had made his position clear, and his authority in the province was absolute. The reforms would go forward whether the conservatives approved or not. After the speech, several officials approached to speak with Grasha and Vincent. Some were genuinely interested in learning more about orc culture and capabilities. Others were clearly skeptical, asking pointed questions designed to catch Grasha in some admission of orcish inferiority. She handled these interrogations with patience and grace, refusing to be provoked, answering each question with facts and examples drawn from her own life. One elderly lord, his face pinched with disapproval, demanded to know how she could expect humans to trust orcs after everything that happened during the war. Grasha met his gaze steadily. "I could ask you the same question," she said quietly. "My uncle was killed by human soldiers. My cousin lost her arm to a human blade. My childhood home was burned by human raiders, but I do not hold every human responsible for those crimes. I judge each person by their own actions, by their own character. Is it too much to ask that you do the same for me and my people?" The Lord had no answer for that. He turned away, his jaw tight, but several others who had overheard looked thoughtful. Vincent's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently, and she squeezed back. They returned to the farm a week later, exhausted but triumphant. News of the governor's reforms spread quickly through the province, carried by travelers and merchants and official messengers. Reactions were mixed. Some communities embraced the changes, eager to tap into orc labor and skills. Others resisted bitterly, clinging to old prejudices. Violence flared in a few places, humans attacking orc workers who tried to take advantage of their new rights, orcs retaliating against particularly cruel human employers. The magistrates cracked down hard on the violence, making it clear that the reforms would be enforced. Several humans were jailed for attacking orcs. Several orcs were jailed for burning human property. The message was clear. The law applied equally now, and both sides would have to adjust. At the Osworth farm, life continued with a new sense of possibility. Grasha's parents visited in late spring, the first time they had been allowed to see her since the wedding. Her mother wept when she saw the farm, the obvious prosperity, the way Vincent looked at her daughter with open adoration. Her father gripped Vincent's hand in both of his and thanked him for treating Grasha with the respect she deserved. Other orc families began to arrive, looking for work, for opportunity, for a chance to build something better. Vincent hired several, expanding the farm's operations, adding new fields and a second barn. Grasha found herself acting as a liaison, translating between the orcish workers and the human ones, smoothing over misunderstandings, building bridges between two groups that had spent so long as enemies. By midsummer, the Osworth farm had become something of a model for integration. Orcs and humans worked side by side, ate their meals at the same tables, celebrated each other's festivals. It was not always easy. There were arguments and tensions and moments when old hatreds flared up. But they worked through them, learning to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of entire races. The neighboring farms noticed the Osworth prosperity and began to cautiously follow suit. Old Castor hired an orc family to help with his expanding dairy operation. The Thornton farm to the west brought on an orc master carpenter, whose skill with wood was unmatched in 3 counties. Slowly, grudgingly, the community was changing. In late summer, Grasha discovered she was pregnant. She told Vincent one evening after dinner, her hands shaking as she placed his palm against her still flat belly. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy was difficult at times, her orc physiology not quite compatible with carrying a half-human child, but she was strong and stubborn and determined. Vincent fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more, hiring additional help so she would not overwork herself. She tolerated his overprotectiveness with amusement and exasperation in equal measure, touched by his concern even when it drove her crazy. In the autumn, a year and a half after their wedding, the provincial governor made an unexpected announcement. He was creating a new position, a regional coordinator for orc integration, and he wanted Grasha to fill it. The job would involve traveling to communities across the province, helping to implement the reforms, mediating disputes, and serving as an example of successful integration. Grasha was stunned. She tried to refuse, citing her pregnancy and her lack of formal education, but the governor was insistent. He sent a representative to the farm to make his case. The representative, a sharp-minded woman named Alara, explained that Grasha's lack of formal education was actually an asset. She had lived the orc experience. She understood both cultures. She had proven she could bridge divides and earn respect through her actions. No amount of university training could replace that. Vincent encouraged her to accept. "You can do this," he said firmly. "You have already been doing it, just informally. This would simply give you the authority and resources to do it on a larger scale. And I will be here, managing the farm, supporting you however you need." After much thought and discussion, Grasha accepted. She would start the position after the baby was born, working part-time at first and increasing her hours as she was able. The salary was generous, more money than she had ever imagined having access to, and the title came with social status that would protect her from some of the worst prejudice. Their daughter was born in late winter, during a snowstorm that buried the province under 3 feet of white. The birth was long and difficult, attended by both a human midwife and an orc healer, 2 women who had to work together to navigate the complications of a mixed-race child. But in the end, after 14 hours of labor that left Grasha exhausted and shaking, they placed a squalling infant in her arms. The baby was perfect. She had her mother's green skin, though a lighter shade, and her father's dark eyes. Small tusks were just visible in her gums. Tufts of black hair covered her head. She was healthy and strong, her lungs demonstrating impressive power as she screamed her displeasure at being born into a cold world. Vincent sat beside the bed, his finger caught in his daughter's tiny fist, tears streaming down his face. "She is beautiful," he whispered. "She is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." They named her Elora, a name that worked in both Orcish and common tongue, a name that reflected both halves of her heritage. Grasha held her daughter and thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the ugliest orc bride in the province, mocked and scorned, to the regional coordinator for orc integration, respected and valued. From a marriage of political necessity to a love so deep, it sometimes took her breath away. From despair and loneliness to hope and family, word of Elora's birth spread quickly. She was the first confirmed half-orc child born since the war, a living symbol of the province's changing attitudes. People were curious, some in good ways and some in bad. The governor sent an elaborate gift basket and a letter of congratulation. Mira and the other women from town came to visit, bringing food and baby clothes and advice. Grasha's parents arrived with gifts from the Orcish clan, traditional blessings and protective charms. There were negative reactions too. Some humans declared that the birth was an abomination, a pollution of human bloodlines. Some orcs felt the same, arguing that Grasha had betrayed her people by bearing a half-breed child. But these voices were fewer and quieter than they had been 2 years ago. The world was changing, slowly and imperfectly, but changing nonetheless. Grasha began her work as regional coordinator when Elora was 3 months old, taking the baby with her on shorter trips and leaving her with Vincent and a trusted nanny for longer ones. The work was challenging and rewarding in equal measure. She traveled to communities across the province, meeting with local leaders, addressing concerns, helping to resolve conflicts. She spoke at town halls and churches, sharing her story, advocating for orc rights, demonstrating through her very presence that orcs and humans could work together successfully. Not every community welcomed her. In some places, she faced hostility and threats. Once, someone threw a rock at her during a public speech, and she had to be escorted away by guards. But more often, people listened. They asked questions. They expressed cautious willingness to try integration, especially when they heard about the economic benefits the Osworth farm had gained from employing orc workers. Vincent managed the farm in her absence, expanding their operations, hiring more workers, implementing innovative techniques that made the Osworth lands even more productive. He consulted with Grasha on major decisions, but he gave her the freedom to pursue her work without guilt or resentment. He understood that what she was doing mattered, not just for them, but for every orc who wanted a better life. Their second winter together was far different from their first. The house was full of warmth and laughter, baby Elora gurgling and cooing from her cradle by the fire. Friends and neighbors visited regularly, humans and orcs mixing together with increasing ease. They hosted a combined winter festival, blending human and orcish traditions, serving food from both cultures, teaching each other songs and dances. On the anniversary of their wedding, Vincent surprised Grasha with a gift. He had commissioned a portrait of them, painted by an artist from the capital. In the painting, they stood together in front of the farm, Vincent's arm around Grasha's waist, both of them smiling. The artist had painted Grasha exactly as she was, green skin and tusks and all, but had somehow captured the strength and dignity and beauty that Vincent saw when he looked at her. It was not a prettified version of an orc. It was simply Grasha, rendered with skill and respect. "For when you doubt yourself," Vincent said softly, "for when the world tries to tell you that you are anything less than extraordinary, look at this and remember what I see. Remember what you have accomplished. Remember that you are loved." Grasha cried, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift, by the love it represented. She hung the portrait in the main room where everyone who visited could see it, a declaration that this was her home, and she was not ashamed of who she was. By the spring of their third year together, the Osworth farm had become the most successful agricultural operation in the province. The governor visited personally to tour the facilities, bringing with him a delegation of officials and foreign dignitaries interested in the province's integration experiment. He praised Vincent and Grasha publicly, calling them pioneers and visionaries, crediting their partnership with helping to heal the wounds of war. More importantly, other marriages began to happen. A human woman in the neighboring county married an orc craftsman. A human widower in Milford proposed to an orc baker whose bread shop had become the most popular in town. These unions were still controversial, still generated gossip and opposition, but they were no longer unthinkable. The path that Vincent and Grasha had walked, rocky and difficult as it had been, had made it easier for others to follow. In late spring, the provincial legislature passed a comprehensive Equal Rights Act, granting orcs full citizenship and legal equality with humans. The vote was close and contentious, but it passed. Discrimination was now illegal, at least on paper. Enforcement would be another matter, but the legal framework was in place. The governor invited Grasha to attend the signing ceremony, and she stood beside him as he signed the bill into law, thinking about all the people who had made this moment possible. Vincent, who had learned to see past his prejudices. The governor, who had the courage to lead change. Her parents, who had sacrificed so much for peace. All the orcs and humans who had been willing to try to bridge the divide, to build something new. That summer, the provincial government awarded Grasha a formal title, Lady Osworth, Regional Coordinator for Integration Affairs. The title came with increased authority and a generous stipend. More importantly, it came with social status that placed her among the provincial elite. She was no longer just an orc who had married a successful farmer. She was a government official, a person of influence and importance in her own right. The ceremony granting her the title was held at the governor's mansion, with hundreds of people in attendance. Grasha wore a gown of deep emerald green that complemented her skin, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated both human and orcish elements. Vincent stood beside her, holding baby Elora, his pride so obvious it made several of the watching humans smile. When the governor placed the formal seal of office around her neck, When he addressed her as Lady Osworth for the first time, Grasha thought about the wedding procession 2 years earlier. She thought about the mockery and shame, the whispers that had followed her through the streets of Milford. She thought about the girl she had been then, broken and desperate and convinced of her own ugliness. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned her own strength, who had earned respect through her actions, who had helped to change the world. She was the ugliest orc bride the province had ever seen, perhaps, but she was also Lady Osworth, respected official and loving wife and devoted mother. She was proof that beauty had nothing to do with symmetrical features and everything to do with the content of one's character. She was proof that love could bridge any divide, that courage could overcome any prejudice, that one person's journey could light the way for thousands to follow. The ceremony ended with applause, and Vincent met her at the bottom of the steps, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both courtly and deeply personal. "My lady," he said with a smile, and the words held 20 layers of meaning, all of them tender. "My love," she replied, and kissed him in front of everyone, a declaration that she was not ashamed, not apologetic, not anything except exactly who she was meant to be. They returned to the farm as summer reached its peak, the fields golden with wheat nearly ready for harvest. Life continued its familiar rhythms, work and family and community blending together. But now there was an ease to it, a sense of arrival and belonging that had been missing before. This was home, truly and completely. These were her people, human and orc alike, united by shared goals and mutual respect. In the autumn, Grasha's parents moved to a small house on the edge of the Osworth property, taking advantage of the new laws that allowed orcs to own land. Her father started a smithy, his skills in metalwork quickly earning him customers from across the county. Her mother planted a garden and helped care for Elora, singing the old orcish lullabies that Grasha remembered from her own childhood. More orc families followed, creating a small community on the edges of Milford. The town expanded to accommodate them, new businesses opening, new houses built. It was not without friction, but the magistrate enforced the equal rights laws strictly, and gradually people adjusted to the new reality. Children grew up playing together, learning that green skin and tusks were just physical characteristics, no more meaningful than hair color or height. Vincent and Grasha had 2 more children over the next 3 years, a son with his father's dark eyes and his mother's pointed ears, and another daughter who looked almost entirely human except for her unusually strong build. The children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with human and orcish traditions. They played with the children of farm workers, both human and orc, learning from an early age that diversity was strength rather than weakness. The farm continued to prosper, its success a testament to what could be achieved through cooperation and mutual respect. Visiting officials from other provinces came to study the Osworth model, hoping to replicate it in their own regions. Vincent and Grasha welcomed them, sharing their experiences and insights, encouraging others to take the risks necessary for real change. 5 years after their wedding, the governor retired and recommended Grasha as his successor for the provincial integration program. She declined, preferring to focus on her family and her work at the local level, but she recommended several other qualified orcs for the position. One of them, a brilliant orc woman who had graduated top of her class at the provincial university, was appointed. The fact that an orc could now hold such a high position, could be considered for governorship itself someday, was a measure of how much had changed. Vincent built Grasha a workshop of her own, a spacious building where she could work on her coordination duties, receive visitors, and hold meetings. He also commissioned a second portrait, this one showing the entire family. Vincent and Grasha with their 3 children standing in front of the farm, surrounded by workers and friends, human and orc together. This portrait hung in the workshop, a reminder of what they had built, what they represented. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the fields, their children playing in the yard, the sounds of the farm settling into evening routines. Vincent would take Grasha's hand as he did every evening, and they would sit in comfortable silence, connected by a love that had started in obligation and grown into something neither of them could have imagined. "You ever regret it?" Grasha asked him once, years into their marriage. "The choices you made, the advocating that made you controversial, the complications of our family." Vincent thought for a long moment before answering. "Never," he said finally. "Not once. You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, we faced opposition and prejudice, but every challenge was worth it for this." He gestured at the farm, at their children, at the life they had built. "For us." Grasha leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling utterly content. "I love you," she said simply. "And I love you," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "My beautiful, brilliant, strong wife. My lady." The children grew, the farm prospered, and the province continued its slow transformation. Grasha's work expanded, her influence spreading, her example inspiring countless others. She received awards and recognition, was invited to speak at universities and government functions, became a symbol of what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, love over prejudice. But her favorite moments were always the quiet ones, the evenings on the porch with Vincent, the mornings waking up beside him, the family dinners where humans and orcs sat together and shared food and stories and laughter. These were the moments that mattered, the small daily affirmations that they had chosen correctly, that love had been worth the risk. 10 years after their wedding, Milford held a celebration honoring the anniversary of the governor's equal rights legislation. The town square was decorated with banners in both human and orcish styles, and the feast featured dishes from both cultures. Vincent and Grasha were the guests of honor, seated at the head table with the magistrate and other local officials. The magistrate gave a speech recounting the changes of the past decade, the challenges overcome, the progress made. He credited Vincent and Grasha with starting it all, with having the courage to show that integration was not just possible but beneficial. The crowd applauded, and several people called out thanks. When it was Grasha's turn to speak, she stood and looked out at the assembled crowd, at the faces both human and orc, at the children playing together without prejudice or fear. She thought about the terrified girl who had walked through these streets a decade ago, convinced of her own worthlessness, and she felt a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. "I was once called the ugliest orc bride in the province," she began, her voice carrying across the square. "And perhaps by certain narrow standards, that was true. But I learned something important over these past 10 years. Beauty is not about symmetry or conventional features. Beauty is about strength of character, about kindness in the face of cruelty, about the courage to love across divides. I was ugly by one measure, but by the measures that actually matter, I have become more beautiful every day, not because I changed physically, but because I grew into myself, accepted my worth, and found people who saw my value." She looked at Vincent, who was watching her with undisguised adoration. "My husband taught me that. Our community taught me that. All of you, by learning to see past old prejudices and embrace new possibilities, taught me that. So thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to become Lady Osworth, not just in title but in truth. Thank you for letting me help build this better world. And thank you for proving that change, real change, is always possible when people choose hope over hate." The applause was thunderous. People stood, clapping and cheering, some wiping away tears. Grasha sat down, feeling Vincent's hand squeeze hers under the table, and let herself feel the full weight of accomplishment. She had started as nothing, as less than nothing in the eyes of many. But she had become something significant, something important, something that mattered. The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. Grasha danced with Vincent, their children, her father, even old Castor, who had become one of her most reliable allies. She danced with humans and orcs alike, spinning under the stars, laughing and alive and utterly, completely happy. This was her life now. Not the nightmare of mockery and isolation she had feared on her wedding day, but a rich tapestry of love and work and community. She was Lady Osworth, respected official and beloved wife and devoted mother. She was proof that a person's beginning did not determine their ending, that transformation was always possible, that love could truly conquer all. When the celebration finally ended and they returned home, Vincent carried their youngest daughter to bed while Grasha tucked in the older children. They met in their bedroom, exhausted but content, and fell into bed together. Vincent wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "Completely," she replied, and it was the absolute truth. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, secure in the life they had built and the love that sustained it. Outside, the farm slept under a canopy of stars, the land they had worked and nurtured and made prosperous through their partnership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to make the world a little better. But tonight, they had this. Each other, their children, their home, their hard-won happiness. Grasha dreamed of the future, of the day when her children would grow up and make their own choices, perhaps marry and have children of their own. She dreamed of a province where mixed marriages were commonplace rather than controversial, where orc officials served at every level of government, where the war was a distant memory rather than a living wound. She dreamed of the day when no orc bride would be mocked for her appearance, when beauty would be measured by character rather than skin color or tusk size. These dreams were not impossible. They were already beginning, small green shoots pushing up through the soil of prejudice, reaching toward the sun. She and Vincent had planted those seeds with their courage and their love. Others would water them, tend them, help them grow. And someday, perhaps sooner than anyone expected, the harvest would come, a world transformed, a province healed, a future bright with possibility. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight, Grasha was simply a woman in love, lying in the arms of her husband, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together. She was Lady Osworth, once the ugliest orc bride in the province, now living proof that worth was earned through action, that love could bridge any divide, and that the most beautiful thing any person could be was authentically, courageously themselves. The story of how she went from mocked bride to lady of the manor was not just her story. It was a story about transformation and hope, about the power of one person's choice to see beyond prejudice, about the ripples that spread when love is given a chance. It was a story that would be told for generations, inspiring others to take their own risks, make their own stands, build their own bridges across the divides that separated people. But for now, on this perfect night, with Vincent's heartbeat steady beneath her ear and their children sleeping safely down the hall, Grasha was content to simply be. To exist in this moment of peace and love, knowing she had earned it, knowing it was real, knowing it would last. She had been given the gift of transformation, and she would spend the rest of her life paying that gift forward, helping others find their own paths from despair to hope, from mockery to respect, from ugliness to beauty. The moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, painting everything in shades of silver, and Grasha closed her eyes and let herself drift into sleep, secure in the knowledge that when she woke, Vincent would still be there, their children would still be safe, and the life they had fought so hard to build would still be waiting for them. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for on that terrible wedding day so many years ago. It was everything, and it was enough, and it was theirs forever.